I was standing in my driveway in Brighton, Colorado, watching the propane delivery truck back up to my tank when I saw her marching across the street like a woman on a mission. Sharon Patterson, the president of our homeowner association, had that look on her face that I'd come to recognize over the past 6 months since moving into Meadowbrook Estates. It was the look that said someone was about to have a very bad day, and apparently that someone was me. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Excuse me, sir. You need to stop what you're doing immediately." I glanced at the delivery driver, a weathered guy in his 50s named Miguel who'd been doing propane deliveries in the area for decades. He gave me a knowing look that said he'd dealt with this type before, then continued unhooking his delivery hose from the truck. "Can I help you?" I asked, already knowing this wasn't going to be a pleasant conversation. Sharon marched right up to me, clutching her ever-present clipboard like it was some kind of divine tablet. She was maybe 52 years old, with an asymmetrical bob haircut that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill and designer athleisure, or that she'd never actually exercised in. Behind her oversized sunglasses, I could practically feel her eyes burning with righteous indignation. "You absolutely can help me, Mr. Logan. You can tell this truck to leave immediately. Commercial vehicles are not permitted on residential streets in Meadowbrook Estates between the hours of 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. on weekdays. It's clearly stated in Section 7, subsection B of our community guidelines." I blinked at her, processing what she'd just said. "Sharon, this is a propane delivery. I need propane. My tank is at 15%. I use it for my heating, my hot water, and my stove. This isn't optional." "I don't care what you use it for," she said, her voice taking on that condescending tone that made my teeth grind. "Rules are rules, Brandon. If we make exceptions for you, then we have to make exceptions for everyone. And before you know it, we'll have commercial trucks driving through here at all hours, disturbing the peace and lowering our property values." Miguel had finished setting up by this point and was standing there with the delivery nozzle in his hand, looking between us like he was watching a tennis match. "Look, lady, I've got 6 more deliveries today. You want to argue about this, fine, but I'm on a schedule." "Don't you lady me," Sharon snapped at him. "I'm the president of this HOA, and I'm telling you that you're in violation of our community standards. I'm going to have to ask you to leave, and Mr. Logan here is going to receive a fine for this infraction." "A fine?" I said, my voice rising despite my best efforts to stay calm. "You're going to fine me for getting a necessary utility delivery. The fine is $250 for the first offense," Sharon said, flipping through pages on her clipboard like she was reading me my Miranda rights. "And if you persist in violating our rules, it will be $500 for each subsequent offense, with the possibility of a lien being placed on your property." I felt my blood pressure spiking. When my wife Sarah and I had bought this house last year, we'd read through the HOA rules, but they'd seemed reasonable at the time. Mostly stuff about keeping your lawn maintained, not painting your house neon colors, and not parking boats or RVs in your driveway. Nobody had said anything about not being able to get propane delivered during normal business hours. "Miguel," I said, making a decision, "go ahead and fill it up." "Don't you dare," Sharon said, stepping forward like she was going to physically block him. "I'm warning you, Brandon. This will not go well for you. Sharon, with all due respect, which at this point is none, I need propane to heat my house and cook my food. It's January. It's 28 degrees outside. You can find me whatever you want, but I'm getting this delivery." Miguel didn't need to be told twice. He started pumping the propane while Sharon stood there sputtering like a kettle about to boil over. She furiously scribbled notes on her clipboard, taking pictures with her phone of the truck, the license plate, and even of me standing there with my arms crossed. "You're going to regret this," she said. "The fine will be in your mailbox by tomorrow, and I'm calling an emergency HOA board meeting to discuss your flagrant disregard for our community standards." "You do that," I said. "I'll be inside, staying warm, thanks to my propane." She stormed off, and Miguel finished the delivery in blessed silence. When he was done, I paid him and added a generous tip for having to deal with that nonsense. "Been doing this for 23 years, Miguel said as he coiled up his hose, "and I've never understood HOAs. You buy a house, pay all that money, and then some neighbor gets to tell you what color you can paint your shutters and when you can get your propane delivered. Doesn't make sense to me." "You and me both, Miguel," I said. Sure enough, the next day there was an official-looking envelope in my mailbox with the Meadowbrook Estates HOA logo on it. Inside was a letter detailing my violation, complete with timestamps and photos, and a bill for $250 payable within 30 days. There was also a notice that I was required to attend an HOA board meeting the following Tuesday evening at 7 p.m. to discuss my ongoing pattern of community standard violations. Ongoing pattern. This was my first offense. Unless you counted the time 3 months ago when Sharon had sent me a sternly worded letter because my grass was supposedly a 1/4 inch too long, which I'd proven was false by literally measuring it in front of her with a ruler. I showed the letter to my wife Sarah that evening when she got home from her job at the hospital. She worked as an emergency room nurse, which meant she had a pretty high tolerance for dealing with difficult people, but even she looked exasperated. $250. She said, holding the letter like it was contaminated. "For getting a utility delivery, that's insane." That's what I said, but apparently Sharon doesn't care. She's on some kind of power trip. Can she actually enforce this? Is this even legal? I don't know, I admitted. I guess we agreed to follow the HOA rules when we bought the house. I just never imagined they'd be this ridiculous about it. Sarah sat down at the kitchen table, reading through the letter more carefully. "It says here that the board meeting is to discuss corrective action and potential additional penalties. What does that even mean?" "Probably means they want to fine me more or threaten to put a lien on the house," I said, feeling my frustration building again. I swear, Sharon acts like she's running a military dictatorship instead of a suburban neighborhood. "Well, you're going to that meeting," Sarah said firmly, "and you're going to fight this. This is completely unreasonable." The next few days passed normally enough, though I noticed Sharon driving by my house more frequently than usual, probably looking for other violations she could cite me for. I made absolutely sure my trash cans were put away within the designated time frame. My lawn was perfect, and there wasn't so much as a stray leaf in my driveway. Tuesday evening rolled around, and I found myself driving to the Meadowbrook Estates Community Center, a pretentious little building with beige siding and way too many decorative columns. Inside, the meeting room was set up like a courtroom, with a long table at the front where the HOA board members sat and rows of chairs facing them. There were maybe a dozen other residents there, probably all dealing with their own ridiculous violations. Sharon sat in the center of the table, flanked by 4 other board members. There was Gerald Morrison, a retired accountant who looked perpetually confused, Linda Chen, who owned a real estate company and seemed to be constantly checking her phone, Robert Hayes, a middle-aged guy who'd apparently never met a rule he didn't like, and Patricia Donovan, an elderly woman who I'd actually had pleasant conversations with at the neighborhood 4th of July barbecue. This meeting of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowner Association will now come to order, Sharon announced, banging a gavel like she was a judge. First order of business, case number 26-01, regarding Brandon Logan at 847 Sunset Ridge Drive. I stood up when she called my name, feeling like I was being arraigned. Mr. Logan, you're here tonight because you received a citation for allowing a commercial vehicle to conduct business on a residential street during prohibited hours. Do you acknowledge receiving this citation? I do, I said, and I'm here to dispute it. That was a propane delivery, which is a necessary utility service. I don't think it's reasonable to expect residents to go without heating fuel because of arbitrary time restrictions. The restrictions are not arbitrary, Sharon said, her voice dripping with condescension. They're in place to maintain the quality of life in our community. Commercial vehicles are loud, they're unsightly, and they lower property values. A propane truck was there for maybe 20 minutes, I countered. And it wasn't any louder than any other vehicle. This is a residential neighborhood, not a library. Robert Hayes leaned forward, looking at some papers in front of him. Mr. Logan, when you purchased your home, you signed an agreement stating that you would abide by all HOA rules and regulations. These rules are clearly spelled out in the community guidelines. Ignorance of the rules is not an excuse for violating them. I'm not claiming ignorance, I said, trying to keep my tone civil. I'm saying the rule is unreasonable when it comes to utility deliveries. What am I supposed to do, freeze to death because my propane company can't deliver after 6 p.m.? You could schedule your delivery for a weekend or after 6 p.m. on a weekday, Linda Chen suggested, barely looking up from her phone. My propane company doesn't deliver on weekends, and they charge a $50 surcharge for after-hours deliveries, I said. Why should I have to pay extra money to comply with an unreasonable rule? The rules apply to everyone equally, Sharon said. If we make an exception for your propane delivery, then the next person will want an exception for their oil delivery, and then someone else will want an exception for their furniture delivery. And before you know it, the whole system breaks down. Then maybe the system needs to break down, I said, my patience finally snapping. Because this is ridiculous. You're fining me $250 for getting a necessary utility delivery. That's not maintaining community standards, that's just petty tyranny. The room went silent. Sharon's face turned an impressive shade of red, and I realized I'd probably just made things worse for myself. But I was past caring. Mr. Logan, Sharon said, her voice dangerously quiet. I'm going to overlook your disrespectful tone because I understand you're frustrated. However, the board has reviewed your case, and we've decided to uphold the fine. You have 30 days to pay, or we will begin proceedings to place a lien on your property. Furthermore, if you have any future violations of this nature, the fines will increase as outlined in the community guidelines. This is absolutely insane, I said. You can't possibly believe this is reasonable. Patricia Donovan, who'd been quiet up until this point, cleared her throat. Sharon, if I may, I do think Brandon has a point. I've lived in this neighborhood for 15 years, and I've never had a problem with utility deliveries. Perhaps we could consider amending the rule to make exceptions for necessary services. The rules are fine as they are, Sharon said firmly. This meeting is concluded. Mr. Logan, you'll receive confirmation of the board's decision in writing within 3 business days. I left that meeting fuming. $250 for a propane delivery. It was insane, but apparently it was also legal since I'd agreed to the HOA terms when I bought the house. I spent the drive home trying to figure out if there was any way to fight this, but the more I thought about it, the more trapped I felt. When I got home, Sarah was waiting up for me. "How did it go?" About as well as you'd expect, I said, collapsing onto the couch. They upheld the fine. Sharon basically told me to shut up and pay it, and if I have any more violations, the fines will get worse. That's ridiculous. There has to be something we can do. I don't know what. We signed the HOA agreement. Legally, they can enforce these rules even if they're stupid. Over the next few weeks, I paid the fine, mostly because I didn't want them putting a lien on our house. It hurt to write that check, and every time I saw Sharon driving around the neighborhood in her white Lexus SUV with her custom license plate that read HOA Prez, I felt my blood pressure spike. But then something interesting started happening. The weather forecast for Brighton and the surrounding areas started predicting an unusually severe cold snap. We were talking about temperatures dropping into the single digits and potentially below zero for an extended period, which was unusual even for Colorado in late January. I made sure our propane tank was full, scheduling the delivery for a Saturday this time to avoid any more drama with Sharon. I also stocked up on extra blankets, made sure our fireplace was clean and ready to go, and checked that all our windows were properly sealed. The cold snap hit on a Wednesday morning, and it was brutal. I woke up to a temperature reading of -4 degrees on my weather app, with wind chills making it feel like -20. Sarah had the day off from the hospital, and we spent the morning staying cozy inside, grateful for our propane heating system keeping the house at a comfortable 70 degrees. Around noon, my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but it had a local area code, so I answered it. Hello. Yes, hi, is this Brandon Logan? A woman's voice asked. It sounded familiar, but I couldn't quite place it. This is Brandon. Who's calling? This is Sharon Patterson. We spoke at the HOA meeting a few weeks ago. I almost dropped my phone. Sharon was calling me. This couldn't be good. What can I do for you, Sharon? I asked, keeping my voice neutral. Well, I'm calling because we have a situation here at the community center, and I was hoping you might be able to help us out. A situation. I waited for her to continue, suddenly very curious about where this was going. Our propane tank at the community center has run out, Sharon said, and I could hear the strain in her voice, like it was physically painful for her to admit this. The heating system is down, and we have several events scheduled here this week, including a children's gymnastics class this evening. I was wondering if you might have any extra propane that we could purchase from you, just temporarily, until we can get a delivery scheduled. I sat there in stunned silence for a moment, processing what she'd just said. The woman who'd fined me $250 for getting a propane delivery 3 weeks ago was now calling me begging to buy propane because the HOA had run out. Brandon, are you still there? Yeah, I'm here, I said slowly. Let me make sure I understand this correctly. You need propane and you want to buy some from me? Yes, that's right. I know we had that issue with your delivery a few weeks ago, but this is an emergency situation. The propane company says they can't get a truck out here until Friday at the earliest because of the weather and the high demand. We're willing to pay you for whatever you can spare. The irony was so thick I could have cut it with a knife. I looked over at Sarah, who was watching me with curious eyes, clearly wondering who I was talking to. Sharon, I find this really interesting, I said. Because when I needed propane 3 weeks ago, you fined me $250 and threatened to put a lien on my house. Now you need propane and you want me to help you out. This is different, Sharon said, her voice getting defensive. This is a community facility that serves all the residents. We have people depending on us. And I had myself and my wife depending on being able to heat our home and have hot water, I countered. But that didn't matter to you then, did it? Look, I understand you're upset about the fine, but this is bigger than that. We have children who are supposed to have their gymnastics class tonight. Their parents have already paid for the session. If we cancel, it's going to cause a lot of problems." I thought about it for a moment. Part of me wanted to tell Sharon to kick rocks and figure out her own solution, just like she'd expected me to do. But there were innocent kids involved who had nothing to do with the HOA's ridiculous rules, and I wasn't going to punish them for Sharon's power trip. "I'll help you out," I said finally, "but I want something in return." "We already said we'd pay you for the propane," Sharon said. "I don't want your money. I want you to rescind my fine and reimburse me the $250 I had to pay. And I want the HOA to amend the rules to allow for utility deliveries during normal business hours." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I don't have the authority to do that on my own," Sharon said finally. "That would require a board vote." "Then call an emergency board meeting," I said. "The same way you did when you wanted to fine me. I'm sure you can get them together pretty quickly when it's something you actually care about." Another pause. "Fine. I'll see what I can do. Can you bring some propane over today?" "I can't bring you propane, Sharon. It's in my tank. It's not like I can just pour it into a bucket and drive it over. You'd need to have a pump and proper containers, and even then, it would be incredibly dangerous and probably illegal." "Then, what are we supposed to do?" Sharon asked, and for the first time, I heard genuine distress in her voice. "You're going to have to cancel your events until you can get a delivery," I said. "Or maybe try calling some other propane companies to see if anyone can get out there sooner. But I can't help you, Sharon. The propane in my tank is for my house, and that's where it's staying. But you said you'd help us." "I said I'd consider helping you if you met my conditions. But physically, there's no way for me to transfer propane from my residential tank to your facility. That's not how it works." Sharon made a frustrated sound. "This is unacceptable. We have a responsibility to our community members. And you had a responsibility to be reasonable with your enforcement of HOA rules, but that didn't stop you from fining me," I said. "I'm sorry the community center is having problems, but this isn't my fault, and it's not my responsibility to fix it." "You're being petty," Sharon said. "No, I'm being realistic. Call your propane company and see if they can expedite the delivery. Maybe offer to pay an emergency service fee. But leave me out of it." I hung up before Sharon could respond, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and frustration. Sarah was looking at me with raised eyebrows. That was Sharon from the HOA? Yep. Their propane tank at the community center ran out, and she wanted me to magically solve their problem for them. "After she fined you for getting a propane delivery." "After she fined me for getting a propane delivery," I confirmed. "The irony is not lost on me." Sarah shook her head. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I'd help if she rescinded my fine and changed the HOA rules, but then explained that I can't actually transfer propane from our tank to theirs, because that's not physically possible without special equipment. She's going to have to figure it out on her own." "Good," Sarah said firmly. "She made her bed, now she can lie in it." That evening, I saw on the Meadowbrook Estates Facebook page that all events at the community center had been canceled until further notice due to facility maintenance issues. The comments were full of frustrated residents wanting to know what was going on and why they hadn't received more advance notice. Sharon posted a response saying that they'd experienced an unexpected equipment failure and were working to resolve it as quickly as possible. She didn't mention that the equipment failure was them running out of propane, probably because she didn't want to look incompetent. The next morning, Thursday, my phone rang again. This time it was Robert Hayes from the HOA board. "Brandon, this is Robert Hayes. I'm calling about the situation at the community center." "Sharon already called me yesterday," I said. I told her I can't help. I understand that, and Sharon explained the technical limitations, but I wanted to talk to you about your conditions for assistance. Sharon mentioned you wanted your fine rescinded and the rules amended. That's right. If the HOA is going to come begging for help, then maybe it's time to admit that the rule about commercial vehicles during business hours is unreasonable, at least when it comes to utility deliveries. I've actually been thinking about that, Robert said, surprising me. I voted to uphold your fine because I believe in following the rules, but this situation with the community center has made me realize that maybe we need to be more flexible. I'm calling to let you know that I'm going to propose an amendment at our next regular board meeting to create exceptions for utility deliveries. That's great, I said, genuinely surprised. What about my fine? I'll also propose that we reimburse you, since you were essentially penalized for doing something that should have been allowed. I can't guarantee the other board members will vote for it, but I think we have a good chance, especially given the current circumstances. I appreciate that, Robert. Really? The next board meeting is scheduled for 2 weeks from now, Robert continued, but I'm going to push Sharon to move it up given the urgency of amending these rules. I'll keep you posted. After I hung up, I felt cautiously optimistic. At least one board member was seeing reason, even if it took their own propane emergency to make it happen. The cold snap continued through Thursday and into Friday. I kept seeing posts on the neighborhood Facebook page from residents complaining about the community center being closed and demanding answers. Sharon's responses were getting increasingly defensive, and I could tell she was feeling the pressure. Friday afternoon, I saw a propane delivery truck pull into the community center parking lot. They'd finally gotten their emergency delivery, probably by paying through the nose for it. I watched from my window as the driver hooked up to their tank and started pumping. The whole process took about 30 minutes. 30 minutes. The same amount of time my delivery had taken, and Sharon had fined me $250 for it. That evening, Sharon posted on the Facebook page that the community center would be reopening on Saturday morning and that all events were back on schedule. She apologized for the inconvenience and thanked everyone for their patience during the unexpected facility issue. I was in the middle of making dinner when there was a knock on my door. Sarah answered it, and I heard her talking to someone before she called me over. It was Sharon, standing on my porch looking uncomfortable and holding a white envelope. "Brandon, I wanted to talk to you in person," she said. "Come in," I said, stepping back to let her inside. The cold air rushed in with her, and I quickly closed the door behind her. Sharon stood in my entryway, looking around at my house like she'd never seen the inside of a normal person's home before. "I wanted to give you this," she said, holding out the envelope. I took it and opened it. Inside was a check for $250 made out to me, along with a letter on official HOA stationery. "The board held an emergency meeting this afternoon," Sharon said. "We voted to reimburse your fine and to amend the community guidelines to allow for utility deliveries during normal business hours. The amendment still needs to be ratified at our next regular meeting, but it should pass without any issues." I looked at the check, then at Sharon. She looked tired, and some of the usual haughtiness was gone from her expression. "Thank you," I said. "I appreciate this." "I also wanted to apologize," Sharon continued, and I could tell the words were difficult for her. "I was too rigid in enforcing the rules. You were right that utility deliveries are different from other commercial vehicles, and I should have recognized that. This whole situation with the community center made me realize that sometimes the rules need to have common sense exceptions." "I appreciate the apology," I said. "And I'm glad the board is willing to amend the rules." Sharon nodded, looking like she wanted to say something else but wasn't sure how. "How much did your emergency propane delivery cost?" she finally asked. "My delivery wasn't an emergency," I said. "It was scheduled regular maintenance." "But I assume your emergency delivery this afternoon cost you quite a bit more than usual." $300 in emergency service fees, Sharon admitted, on top of the normal delivery cost. And we still have to cancel 2 days' worth of events, which meant refunding rental fees and dealing with angry residents. "Maybe that's something to think about next time you're considering whether a rule is worth enforcing," I suggested gently. "I will," Sharon said. "And thank you for not, gloating about this on the Facebook page or anything. I know you could have made this situation a lot worse for me." "I'm not interested in making enemies in my own neighborhood," I said. "I just want to be able to maintain my house and live my life without unreasonable interference. That's all any of us want." Sharon left a few minutes later, and I showed Sarah the check and the letter. "Well, that's a surprising development," Sarah said. "Sharon actually apologized." "And the board amended the rules," I added. "I honestly didn't think they'd do it, at least not this quickly." "Funny how a little taste of their own medicine made them see reason," Sarah observed. The amended rules were ratified at the next HOA board meeting, which I attended just to make sure everything went through properly. Robert Hayes presented the amendment, explaining that it created a specific exception for utility deliveries including propane, heating oil, water, and similar necessary services. The amendment passed unanimously, with even Sharon voting in favor. After the meeting, Patricia Donovan came up to me. "I'm glad this got resolved," she said. "I've been on this board for 8 years, and sometimes I think we forget that we're here to help maintain the neighborhood, not to make life difficult for our residents." "I appreciate you speaking up at that first meeting," I said. It meant a lot that at least someone on the board was willing to question the rule. "Well, hopefully, this will remind us all to think more carefully about whether our rules are actually serving their intended purpose," Patricia said. "Although between you and me, I think Sharon needed this lesson more than anyone." As winter turned to spring, life in Meadowbrook Estates settled into a more comfortable rhythm. Sharon was still the HOA president, but she seemed to have backed off on some of her more aggressive enforcement tactics. I still saw her driving around the neighborhood in her Lexus, but now she'd wave when she passed, instead of scrutinizing my property for violations. My propane deliveries continued without incident, scheduled during normal business hours just like they always had been. Miguel, my delivery driver, commented on the change when he came out for my next scheduled delivery in April. "No angry HOA lady this time?" he asked with a grin. "No angry HOA lady," I confirmed. They amended the rules after their own propane tank ran out, and they realized how important utility deliveries are. "Karma's a beautiful thing," Miguel said, laughing. "I've been in this business long enough to see all kinds of ridiculous situations, but that one's going to be a story I tell for years." In May, the HOA held their annual neighborhood barbecue at the community center. It was one of the few HOA-sponsored events that I actually enjoyed, mostly because it was a chance to meet neighbors and eat good food without any drama. I was loading up my plate with burgers and potato salad when Sharon approached me. She looked relaxed, wearing casual clothes instead of her usual designer athleisure, and she was actually smiling. "Brandon, I wanted to thank you again for how you handled the situation back in January," she said. "I know I didn't make it easy on you, and you could have been a lot more difficult about the whole thing." "Water under the bridge," I said. "The important thing is that the rules got changed and it won't be a problem for anyone else going forward." I've been thinking about that a lot actually, Sharon said. About how we enforce rules and whether we're sometimes creating problems instead of solving them. The board has been reviewing a lot of our policies to see where else we might need to add common sense exceptions. That sounds like a good idea, I said, genuinely impressed. What kind of policies are you looking at? Well, for example, we have a rule about not working on your car in your driveway, which was meant to prevent people from setting up automotive repair shops in their garages. But we've been fining people for changing their own oil or replacing a battery, which seems excessive. We're working on clarifying that basic vehicle maintenance is allowed. That's a really positive change, I said. We're also looking at the rules about lawn care, Sharon continued. Right now, the guidelines require grass to be kept between 2 and 3 inches tall, which is very specific. But different types of grass grow at different rates, and measuring everyone's lawn with a ruler isn't really practical. We're thinking about changing it to just require that lawns be well maintained and only taking action if something is clearly neglected. Those sound like really reasonable adjustments, I said. Sharon nodded. I realized after everything that happened that I was more focused on enforcing rules than on building a good community. And those aren't the same thing. Sometimes enforcing rules actually damages the community if the rules aren't reasonable. It was a surprisingly insightful admission, and I found myself gaining a new respect for Sharon. It took courage to admit when you'd been wrong, especially for someone in a leadership position. Over the summer, I noticed the changes Sharon had mentioned actually being implemented. The HOA newsletter, which used to be full of violation notices and stern reminders about rules, became more focused on community events and helpful information. There were still rules, of course, but they were enforced with a lighter touch and more common sense. In August, I received a notice that my next-door neighbor had requested permission to build a storage shed in his backyard. The HOA was soliciting feedback from adjacent property owners before approving the project. It was the kind of reasonable process that should have been in place all along, and I was glad to see it working the way it was supposed to. I submitted a comment saying I had no objections to the shed, and it was approved within 2 weeks. My neighbor, a guy named Tom who worked as an engineer for a tech company, came over to thank me for the quick response. I was worried it was going to be this whole ordeal, Tom admitted. I've heard horror stories about HOAs taking months to approve simple projects and demanding all kinds of modifications, but this was actually really straightforward. I think the HOA is trying to be more reasonable about stuff, I said. They went through some growing pains earlier this year, but it seems like they learned from it. Yeah, I heard about that, Tom said. Something about propane deliveries. Sharon mentioned it at one of the board meetings. That was me, I admitted. It was a whole thing, but it worked out in the end. The years continued to pass peacefully in Meadowbrook Estates. Sarah and I settled into our home, making friends with neighbors and actually starting to appreciate some of the HOA amenities. The community center pool was really nice in the summer, and they started organizing more events that people actually wanted to attend, like outdoor movie nights and holiday parties. Sharon served out her term as HOA president and eventually stepped down, though she remained on the board. Patricia Donovan took over as president, bringing a more collaborative approach to leadership. Under Patricia's guidance, the board started holding quarterly town halls where residents could voice concerns and suggestions before they became major issues. I never forgot the lesson from that January cold snap, though. Sometimes people need to experience consequences themselves before they can understand why their rules might be unreasonable. Sharon had learned that lesson the hard way, and to her credit, She'd actually changed her behavior because of it. Looking back on the whole situation, I realized it had actually made our community stronger. The conflict had forced necessary conversations about the purpose of HOA rules and how they should be enforced. It had reminded everyone, board members and residents alike, that we were all neighbors trying to maintain a nice place to live, not adversaries in some kind of enforcement war. My propane deliveries continued like clockwork, scheduled during normal business hours without any drama or fines. Every time Miguel pulled up in his truck, I remembered that cold January day when Sharon had tried to find me, and then the ironic twist when she'd called begging for help. It was a reminder that what goes around really does come around, and that sometimes the best way to change an unjust system is simply to stand your ground and let natural consequences do their work. The community center never ran out of propane again. They implemented a better monitoring system and started scheduling deliveries well before the tank got low. They also kept a backup generator on site, just in case, though they never needed to use it. As for Sharon, she and I actually became friendly over time. Not close friends exactly, but we'd chat at neighborhood events and wave when we passed each other on the street. She'd learned her lesson about power trips and rigid rule enforcement, and I'd learned that even people who seem unreasonable can change when given the right motivation. In the end, that fine and the propane crisis that followed turned out to be one of the best things that could have happened to Meadowbrook Estates. It forced necessary changes that made the neighborhood a better place to live for everyone. Rules became more reasonable, enforcement became more fair, and the community became stronger. And every time I heard Miguel's propane truck rumbling down my street during normal business hours, I couldn't help but smile, remembering the time when that simple sound had caused such an uproar, and how justice had eventually prevailed in the most ironic way possible. The check for $250 that Sharon had given me was long since cashed and spent, but I kept the apology letter in a drawer as a reminder that people can change, communities can improve, and sometimes the best revenge is simply being right and waiting for others to figure it out on their own. Years later, when new residents moved into the neighborhood and complained about HOA rules, I'd tell them the story of the great propane incident of that January. It became a sort of neighborhood legend, a cautionary tale about the importance of reasonable governance and the dangers of power trips. Sharon took it in stride, occasionally even telling the story herself at board meetings as an example of why they needed to think carefully about rule enforcement. The community guidelines were revised several more times over the years, always with input from residents, and always with an eye toward being reasonable rather than punitive. The philosophy shifted from catching violations to maintaining community standards, which seemed like a small distinction, but made a huge difference in practice. I continued to live happily in Meadowbrook Estates with Sarah, enjoying our home and our neighbors without the constant worry of arbitrary fines and unreasonable rules. The propane tank hummed quietly behind the house, keeping us warm in winter and providing fuel for cooking year-round, and nobody ever bothered us about getting it filled. And that, ultimately, was all I'd ever wanted. Just to be left alone to maintain my house, take care of my property, and live my life without unnecessary interference. It had taken a fine, a cold snap, an emergency, and a healthy dose of irony to make it happen, but in the end, justice had prevailed, the rules had changed, and the community had become better for everyone involved. The whole experience taught me something valuable about standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult, and even when the system seems stacked against you. Sometimes you have to fight arbitrary authority, And sometimes the best weapon in that fight is simply being reasonable and letting unreasonable people face the natural consequences of their unreasonable rules. Sharon learned that lesson too, though she had to learn it the hard way. In the end, we all benefited from her education, and Meadowbrook Estates became a better place because one HOA president finally understood that power should be used to help people, not to control them unnecessarily. As I sat on my porch one evening in late autumn, watching the sun set over the Colorado landscape and feeling the warmth from my propane-powered heating system keeping the house comfortable despite the dropping temperatures, I reflected on how much had changed since that cold January day. Life in an HOA didn't have to be a constant battle. With reasonable rules, fair enforcement, and leaders who were willing to admit when they were wrong, it could actually be a positive experience. And if nothing else, I'd learned that sometimes karma works in mysterious ways. Sharon had tried to fine me for getting propane, and then she'd ended up desperately needing propane herself. The universe had delivered a lesson more effectively than any argument I could have made, and everyone had benefited from it. I raised my coffee mug in a silent toast to Miguel, who continued faithfully delivering propane throughout Brighton and the surrounding areas, probably never fully realizing that he'd been at the center of a minor neighborhood revolution. Then I went inside to have dinner with Sarah, grateful for my warm house, my reasonable HOA, and the hard-won peace that had come from standing up for common sense in the face of arbitrary authority. The propane tank outside continued its quiet work, just as it always had and always would, a silent monument to the triumph of reason over rigid bureaucracy, and a reminder that even the smallest battles can have meaningful consequences when you're willing to fight for what's right.